Welcome to Small Arms Solutions. Today we're going to be going over a factory, it's not really a factory cutaway, but it's a cutaway of the M16A1 rifle, which is, in this case, semi-automatic only. Cutaways are very much used by trainers. I use them quite a bit because it's a perfect way to explain exactly what's happening inside that rifle at any given time during its cycle of operations. Of course, today we have a lot of 3D videos and we have all these animations and stuff that show that. But back in the old days, before we had all this stuff, cutaways were a major tool that we used in armorers training. Most contracts, for instance, like that we had at Colt or even Lewis Machine Tool or any of these companies who I work with, when you deliver a family of weapons, a new weapon system, there's X amount of these cutaways that are sold with that contract for the training purposes. Now, cutaways are very rare, for instance, in this case, in semi-automatic only, and that's for good reason. There's a pretty neat story behind this one, which we're going to do in a second. But I'm a firm believer in using cutaways as training aids. Now, I will say, nowadays with some of the animations, they do tend to work even better. You can even see more with the animations. But back in the old days, this was what we did, and it's still being done today. These are still being made. Right before I left Colt, our LE sales manager, who was in charge of all the armorers training, he had actually ordered probably 10 or 12 Cutaway LE 6920s from the model shop for that purpose. For the cutaways for instance, for Colt, it's far more difficult to get a cutaway out that's fully automatic, because even though these are cutaway and not capable of being fired, they would still qualify as NFA weapons or full automatic weapons because of the auto sear that was in there. That theoretically you could drop off the upper receiver, and replace it with a standard one, and the gun would function. Now, how long it would function, I don't know, but it still could be useful as a selective fire lower. So it was much better for the Colt LE guys to be able to get their hands on some semi-automatic only ones, which the restriction and transport would be much easier. So I'll tell you a little bit about where this one comes from. I spent my first, I spent 10 years in law enforcement as a forensic firearms examiner. My first couple of years, I went to our AFTI conference. AFTI is the Association of Firearms and Tool Examiners. That was the governing body of everybody who was in that profession. That's where all the standardization came out, all the training criteria came out. And it's where once a year all the examiners would go to. Papers would be presented on new techniques for forensic firearms identification. This particular one, I delivered a presentation I had done on being able to determine by looking at a 7.62 millimeter cartridge case, just by looking at the cartridge case, knowing whether it came out of an AK or an SKS family of weapons. So I had done that there. Well, at the we had raffles going on throughout the week. This particular rifle was manufactured by an amateur machinist who was also a firearms examiner in California. He had gotten the rifle from their destruction guns, and he had cut out everything on a mill to manufacture this particular rifle. He also had done a 1911. I think he had done some sort of a shotgun as well. So we had all these set out on a table with these bowls of raffle tickets. And I wanted this thing in the absolute worst way. In fact, I wanted it so bad that all the money that I was given for food by DOJ for that week all went towards buying raffle tickets. I probably had $300 worth of raffle tickets in that canister, hoping I was going to win this. And sure enough, in the end, I actually did win it, and I was ecstatic. That was also before I was doing the armor schools and everything. It was just something that I by far knew I was going to appreciate. So I'll talk a little bit about this one in particular. The way this one was made, this one is not a firearm. And the way that was done was everything here was all cut out, and the upper and lower receiver were permanently attached to each other. So you couldn't separate this upper and lower receiver to utilize this as a firearm. So I have the paperwork for this that states that this is not a firearm. There is a serial number on it, but it is not legally a firearm. And right above me, you'll see this green case that appears to be an ammo. Looks like an old military ammo crate. My wife had worked with somebody in a law firm in Milwaukee whose husband was a carpenter, and he custom made this for me for this to go into. And prior to moving here to Texas, this was hanging on my wall. And one day again, when I have a true office, this will be hanging on my wall again. But what we're going to do is we're going to go through this from butt to muzzle and show the cycle of operations, and we're going to show how each of these components work. It's very interesting to see how everything actually works. Because when you pull the trigger, the bolt and everything doesn't magically happen. There's a whole cycle of things that happen throughout that process to make that firearm work. So that's what we're going to start doing right now. We can see a cutaway here showing the compartment where we put the cleaning kit. This is the original A1 type stock. This is the much thinner type material that was used on the A1s prior to the glass-filled nylon that's used on the A2s. Here we see the recoil spring, and we can see the cutaway buffer as well. We can see the buffer's bumper right here. We can see the buffer itself. We can see the spacer, and we can slightly see one of the steel weights. There's actually 5 of these steel weights with rubber wafers in there. Going forward, we see the forward assist and how it works. We see the pawl right here. And as the forward assist is engaged, we can see how it hits the notch on the bolt carrier group to force it forward. Here we can see how the rear takedown pin works. You can see the detent spring. And as we push that forward, we can see how that spring will move to the rear. We're able to see as the takedown pin moves up, we can see that pin engage the surface, and so it locks it to the open position. Now, as we open up, we pull the bolt carrier group out, and we can see the carrier itself. We're going to go over some of the neat little details on here. We have the carrier key itself, which you can see the path of the gas. As the gas tube bleeds the gas into the carrier key, it goes down. We have the bolt now in the lock position. The location, as you see right here, from the back here to the front of here, this is the expansion chamber. This is your actual piston. This is still a piston-operated rifle, but the pistol is internal here in the carrier rather than at the front sight base. So as the gas goes down into here, this area fills up with gas, creates a hammer-like blow. And as the bolt carrier moves rearward, we can see the cam pin as it starts to move, to unlock. We also notice the gas port holes here. This is, you can see one, the other one's down here. As the bolt unlocks, you can see how it clears those 2 exhaust ports. So what's happening now is as soon as the gas rings clear, now we're venting all the unneeded gas out both of those holes. You can also see there's another gas port hole that's been machined away that's right around in this area here that also bleeds out gas. What we're going to dispense now is a misnomer that's been going around since the beginning of this rifle, and is that your gas rings have to be staggered for the rifle to function. That is completely not true. When the rifle is in the closed position, as the bolt goes into the lock position, you will see how the gas rings will seal off the gas chamber. Well, as they do that, this area gets slightly smaller, and it pushes the gas rings together. And you're basically closing up all those gaps in those gas rings so it seals. So it doesn't matter whether they're staggered or together, those gas rings are contracted to seal the gas chamber off. So, and you can see that happening here, going from the unlocked into the lock position. So that's definitely a fallacy we're going to get rid of. So now what we're going to see is the cam path itself. When it's in the lock position, you will see that this is in the rear position. Once we get this back together, we're going to show you exactly how the cam track works, the cam pin along with the track inside of the rifle here. So, path of the gas. Bolt goes into the lock position. The hammer strikes the firing pin, fires the cartridge. Bullet travels down the barrel. The actual flow of the gas goes from the carrier key down into the expansion chamber. Carrier begins to move rearward because of that pressure. As it moves rearward, a couple things are happening. One, the cam pin and the bolt start to unlock, but as it unlocks, as it's already had enough pressure to move rearward, the gas rings clear those exhaust ports, and it clears the gas, and the excess gas is now vented. We're going to take a look at the cutaway bolt now, so we're going to see how the extractor and ejector work. This is a cutaway showing how both the ejector, this is the ejector spring, we see the extractor, we see the copper colored extractor spring and buffer, and this also has a rubber O-ring in it. So this shows you how you have the tension on your extractor. We see the pushed in or the crushed extractor that shows how the spring tension is working. We also see how the rubber donut works. The rubber donut is the whole area in front here. That rubber donut actually has much more extraction power than the extractor spring has. In reality, you could have the extractor spring and the extractor spring buffer removed and just have that O-ring in there, and you will still have much more extraction force than you have just with the extractor spring alone. We do see the gas rings. In front, you can see how the extractor claw is, where it grabs onto the cartridge case rim, and here's your spring. So this shows you how all those parts move together. Right here, we see the bolt in the unlock position. It's slightly moved back. At this location here, this is what's referred to as the barrel extension. This area here is where the locking lugs on the bolt clear the barrel extension. And as the bolt goes into the lock position, it rotates so the rear of the locking lugs engages the back of the lug here. We can see the chrome-plated chamber right here, and we also see the slip ring, the spring weld, and the snap ring is not really visible, but we can see that as well. Now, what I want you to pay attention to is as the bolt carrier group moves forward, the bolt now clears the barrel extension. We move forward, and at this point, we see as the cam pin moves forward, which is this area right here, and you can see how the notch in the receiver now moves it into the lock position. Now that it's in the lock position, now we're going to look back over here. We now have the closed position. Now the bolt's going to rotate. And now, as it rotates, the rear of the locking lug is now behind the lug on the barrel extension. So now we're into the lock position. So now we're going to take a look down at the trigger mechanism. Another feature that's shown on this cutaway is the original Colt automatic sear block. You see we have a pin right here, and you see this raised area right here. This is a piece of metal that was put in place and pinned in place. So you would not be able to machine it out and install an auto sear. The actual auto sear pin would be right in this area in here. So it would be in between the block and the receiver. So you would not be able to drill the auto sear pin hole here at all. Also, this block here, by this being raised up, this prevents you from being able to put in a fully automatic bolt carrier. The automatic sear trip area would catch on here and you wouldn't be able to close the receiver. Also, on the fire control part variations, Colt had to modify their semi-automatic hammer. They had to make it this a flat where this used to stick up a lot more. That was so it would be able to clear the automatic sear block. Looking at the way this is situated, first I want to talk about the hammer and trigger springs. The springs you see right here, this is the hammer spring. The way the mechanism works that prevents the trigger pin from walking out is the hammer spring leg sits right on the notch on the hammer pin, and we can see that's in place right here. That's what keeps the trigger pin from walking out, because it sits on that notch. And for as far as the hammer pin, we can see right here the J pin. That comes straight down here and it locks into the middle of the trigger pin. And those are the two ways that these pins are locked into place so they don't move out. Now I want to show you how the selector or safety works and how the sear surfaces work as well. First thing we're going to take a look at is the safety or selector detent and the spring. As we rotate it from safe to fire, you can see how the pin moves down to disengage, and as it rotates back into the fire position, that will pop right back up into place and lock it into place. Now we're in the cock position. You can see that the hammer nose and the trigger nose are connected. As we pull the trigger to the rear, the trigger nose drops, releasing the hammer nose forward to fire. Now, as the trigger is held to the rear, as the bolt carrier starts to move forward after it's fired from the unlock position to the extraction ejection, it begins to move the hammer back. And as you can see, the disconnector surface, which you see right here, engages the hammer. Click. So now when you were to release the trigger, it will release the hammer nose to the trigger nose. Now we're ready to fire the next shot. We're not going to go over fully automatic because that's not what we have here. But this shows you the actual cycle of the trigger mechanism. Again, pulling the trigger, releases the front of the nose, drops down, releases the hammer, the spring goes forward, fires. As the bolt carrier moves rearward, comes back, the hammer engages the disconnector, catches onto the claw. Then when you release the trigger, it releases from the disconnector, the hammer to the trigger nose. Next thing we're going to look at is the bolt catch right here. Now you can see, because there are dummy rounds in here, the bolt catches forward. It's not engaged. We're now going to switch magazines. We're going to drop this magazine out. And we're going to insert this PMag. Now the PMag is empty. Now I want you to watch how the follower will catch the bolt catch. Well, now notice that the bolt catch is in the forward position. It's not being used. What happens is when the rifle fires its last shot, the follower on the magazine will catch the tab on this bolt catch, lift it up, and as it lifts it up, it will lock the bolt to the rear. So we're going to engage the empty magazine. At this point, the follower is engaged by the bolt catch, and now the bolt catch is engaged. And as this area sticks up right here, this is what will stop the bolt from moving forward. So this is how the components work, the various assemblies. What we're going to look at now is the flow of gas. What we're going to do now is we're going to go through the actual cycle of operation, starting with feeding and chambering and locking. Feeding, chambering, and locking is done once the bolt carrier is released. The bolt carrier will come over, it will strip the round off of the magazine. It will go, which is feeding. Then the bolt will, as it moves forward, will push the round into the chamber, which is called chambering. And once the round is seated into the chamber, we'll have locking. So that's all going to be done by me releasing the bolt catch. So we're going to hit the bolt catch. All that just took place. Once the bolt was released, strip the round off of the magazine, feeding, chambering the round going into the chamber. Once the round is into the chamber, we've achieved locking. The rifle is now ready to fire. So what's going to happen now, as we pull the trigger, the hammer is going to be released to strike the firing pin. The firing pin now will strike the primer, which will create the spark, will ignite the propellant, which will drive the cartridge down the barrel. Once the round goes down the barrel, it will enter the gas port. This portion of the cutaway of the gas tube shows that it is a hollow tube. Right down here is the gas port. The gas port is cut into the barrel, and that's going from about here down. The amount of gas that goes into the system is determined by the size of the gas port in the barrel. So the bullet passes the gas port, gas is bled up through the gas port into the front sight base, into the gas tube. Now the gas tube will take, in the case of a rifle, about 13,000 psi of gas will be forced into the gas tube, will go all the way back into the gas tube. So the gas will go from the gas tube into the carrier key. From the carrier key down into the expansion chamber, which is created between the back of the bolt and the back of the carrier. As the gas fills the expansion chamber, it creates a hammer-like blow, driving the carrier rearward. As the carrier goes rearward, we can see as the carrier comes back, we can see how the cam pin is now rotated by the notch in the upper receiver. To now, as it unlocks, the bolt carrier starts moving rearward. And this begins the extraction and ejection process. So now we have begun extraction. As you can see, the cartridge case is now being pulled from the chamber, which is extraction. This goes all the way back to the rear. Now we have ejection. And if we also notice during that extraction and ejection, we have cocking. As you can see that the hammer is now being pushed back to engage the disconnector. Now the recoil spring will start pushing the bolt carrier forward. Now as the bolt is released, it feeds, chambers, locks. Now as you watch as I release the trigger, you will see that the hammer is being released to the trigger. Now the cycle is reset, it's ready for its next shot. This is probably the best way that we could actually show this in a film. Unfortunately, I don't have enough hands to try to make everything show smoothly. But this is the precise cycle of operations that the rifle goes through, being seen on the Cutaway. We're just going to do a recap on the cycle of operations from the Cutaway. We start in the ready to fire position. The trigger is pulled, strikes the firing pin, which in turn strikes the primer, creating the spark, which ignites the propellant. Propellant creates massive pressure, which drives the projectile down the bore. As the bullet travels down the barrel, the projectile will pass the gas port, where in this case 13.5 thousand psi is drawn back into the gas tube. As a bullet passes the gas port, it creates what's called dwell, or it works as a plug to keep the system pressurized while the action is working. The bullet will actually leave the barrel before the unlocking process starts. So as the gas comes back, goes all the way back into the gas tube, where the gas tube goes into the carrier key. The gas is now bled from the gas tube into the carrier key down into the expansion chamber, which is created between the back of the bolt, back of the carrier, which is the quote piston. We will have as the trigger is pulled, the bolt carrier will move rearward, and as the bolt carrier moves rearward, the bolt will unlock. The extractor will pull the spent cartridge case out of the chamber, and then once the cartridge case will clear the ejection port, it will eject it out of the rifle. And then once the bolt carrier goes all the way to the rear, the compressed spring will move the bolt carrier group forward. We're going to try and show that again. As the bolt comes back to the rear, extracts and ejects. Also at this point, cocking is taking place where the bolt carrier pushes downward on the hammer, where it engages with the disconnector. At this point, we have extraction ejection completed. Now we're going to feed, chamber, and lock, and that will be done in one swift motion. At this same point here, you will see that the hammer is being pushed back, and it's going to be connected with the disconnector. So now we're going to release forward. Now we've completed feed, chamber, and lock. We're ready for the next shot. So this gives you a really good idea of what happens once you pull the trigger. Now we'll see a little bit of fumbling in there. This was an amateur Cutaway. There's still edges and burrs in there where sometimes things can catch. It's not like it would be, say, for instance, if it was a factory Cutaway by Colt or LMT, where everything's done by CNC machine. This was done by hand on a mill. But I do believe that you're going to be able to see everything that happens once you pull the trigger, and by seeing how the internal parts work, you're going to have an understanding of exactly what happens. I hope you enjoyed this video and were able to follow well. If you liked it, please click like, please subscribe, and even better, share.